Mummies, written by Lisa Ng. Introduction. In modern countries around the world, including Egypt, people are often buried in coffins after they die. Sometimes the body is cremated, and the ashes are either kept by loved ones or spread over an area that the person enjoyed, such as the ocean. But this is not the way it has always been. The ancient Egyptians turned their dead into mummies. The ancient Egyptians are famous for making mummies. They mummified everyone from kings to pets by drying the bodies, rubbing them with spices, and wrapping them in strips of cloth. However, the Egyptians are not the only people that mummified their dead. There is evidence of mummification in many places around the world. What are mummies? A mummy is a preserved corpse. Normally, a dead body decays very quickly. Bacteria in the air start decomposing body cells immediately after death. If the body is left alone, scavengers and pests like vultures and flies devour the corpse. In a mummy, the decay process is arrested, and the dead body is preserved for thousands of years. The first mummifications occurred naturally, in areas that were too dry or cold for bacteria to grow. Bodies were preserved without human interference. Later on, people developed ways to preserve mummies artificially. Mummification. The first Egyptian mummies were buried in the hot desert sand. It was so dry that the bodies dried out almost immediately, preserving them from decay. These dried mummies looked a lot like beef jerky. Their flesh became tough and hard. Unfortunately, unprotected bodies buried in the desert were often eaten by jackals, which love the taste of human jerky. Egyptians tried to protect their buried ancestors by covering the burial site with rocks. Wealthier Egyptians buried family members in painted coffins. But the coffins, which kept out the jackals, also kept out the hot sand, and the bodies inside decayed. Resourceful Egyptians developed ways to preserve the bodies before burial. When someone died, the body was given to a team of embalmers. First, the embalmers laid the body face up on a 6-foot-wide embalming table. Their first job was to remove all the soft organs that encouraged the growth of bacteria. They carefully pulled the brain out through the nose with an embalming hook, making sure not to deform the person's face. The brain was not very important to the ancient Egyptians. They believed that the heart was the most important organ, and that it was the center of thought and feeling. Do you know? The Egyptians believed that the first mummy was the god Osiris. He was murdered by his brother Set and cut into pieces. His wife, Isis, put him together with magic, and his jackal-headed nephew, Anubis, embalmed him. Osiris then became the god of the dead and the underworld. The chief embalmer cut an incision in the left side of the stomach. From this hole, the embalming team pulled out all the internal organs, except the heart, and placed them to the side. The stomach, liver, lungs, and intestines were preserved individually in special jars called canopic jars. These organs accompanied the body during burial, but were not as important as the heart. The heart was preserved inside the body. Embalmers washed the body inside and out with palm wine. The alcohol in the wine killed bacteria. By this time, the body had probably begun to stink, a sign of decay. So the embalmers filled the body with bags of sweet-smelling spices mixed with natron, a special salt. Then they covered up the body and internal organs with more natron and left them alone for 40 days. The whole mummification process took 70 days. Once the drying process had been completed, the embalmers removed the salt. The mummy became very light, since all the water, which made up over 65% of the body's weight, had been removed. The embalmers filled the inside of the corpse with linen stuffing, producing a body that appeared strong and healthy instead of shriveled. Then, they rubbed the corpse with more spices, mixed with wax and oil, to make it smell sweet. Next, a sticky resin made of tree sap was poured over the body. When the resin hardened, it formed a thin, protective shell around the body. This shell protected the mummy from bacteria and caused it to become darker in color. Embalmers often applied makeup to the mummy's face to make it look more alive. They also placed jewelry on a rich person's corpse before wrapping it up. The resin-soaked wrap consisted of linen bandages the length of a football field. The wrap helped to preserve the shape of the body. The best linen was saved for the outermost layer of bandages. Cheap linen was used on the inside, where it couldn't be seen. Magical charms and talismans, meant to ensure the mummy's safety in the realm of the dead, were put between the layers of bandages. These talismans were carved out of precious stones. The steps of mummification. 1. Place the body on a large table facing up. 2. Remove internal organs through a cut in the abdomen. 3. Wash the body with palm wine. 4. Dry the body by covering it with piles of salt. 5. Remove the salt and rub the body with sweet herbs. 6. Stuff the body with linen and bags of spices. 7. Cover the body with resin. 8. Apply makeup and jewelry. 9. Wrap the body in bandages. Do you know? In the Middle Ages, doctors in Europe prescribed mummy powder, made from ground-up mummies. They thought that mummy dust would cure sick people, but it usually only made them sicker. The afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that immortality depended on having a well-preserved body. They believed that a dead person split up at the moment of death into several parts: the ba, the ka, and the physical body. The ka was a person's ghostly identical twin. It lived inside the mummified heart and could not move from the tomb. The ba, which represented the personality and spirit of a person, was a human-headed bird that could fly around freely by day. The ba and the ka joined to form the ak, a person's soul. According to ancient Egyptian belief, a dead person's soul traveled through the dangerous realm of the dead to a special palace of judgment called Osiris's Palace. Along the way, the soul dodged monstrous snakes and crocodiles while crossing huge rivers of fire. Osiris, the god of the dead, judged everyone by weighing their hearts on a scale. If a person's heart was heavy with sin, it was thrown to the hungry monster beneath the scales. That person would die permanently. But if the heart was lighter than a feather, then the dead person would live forever, or be immortal in the world of Osiris. When the Egyptians first began to make mummies, only very rich or important people were mummified. They believed that only pharaohs and nobles deserved an afterlife. However, as the embalming process became easier and the Egyptians became richer, more people were mummified. The Egyptians eventually believed that everyone deserved to have a chance at immortality. Since the Egyptians believed that the afterlife was exactly like life, they buried mummies with their favorite objects and tools. Wealthy nobles were buried with gold and gems. Children were buried with their favorite toys. Everyone was buried with clay representations of food and drink, and with clay figurines called shabtis, servants who would work for them in the afterlife. The burial. Mummies were laid to rest in decorated coffins, usually made of papier-mâché and beaten gold. Richer people were buried in a sarcophagus made of stone or a coffin of imported wood. Pharaohs were buried in up to 4 gold-covered coffins nested inside each other. The coffins were painted with a representation of the person's face, so that the Ba could find the right tomb when it returned at night. Hieroglyphs, painted or chiseled onto the coffin, told the story of the person's life. These inscriptions also held spells to keep the dead person safe in the underworld. Superstitions were common in Egypt. Most people believed that mummies would curse anyone who disturbed their tomb and stole from the dead. But tempted by the treasures buried with the mummies, thieves broke into even the best-guarded tombs. They often tore the mummies apart, looking for the gold and gems under the bandages. They were willing to risk death and punishment for riches. Most tombs were robbed within a few years of their mummies' burials. The Tomb of Tutankhamun. The pharaoh Tutankhamun, also called the Boy King, died when he was only a teenager. We know very little about his life or his rule in Egypt, but he is the most famous mummy in the world. Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in 1923. Even though it had been robbed twice in ancient times, King Tut's tomb still held great treasures. The thieves had entered the second room, which was filled with Tut's gold chariots and statues. They stole about 1/6 of the tomb's gold, but were probably interrupted before they could finish. King Tut's mummy had not been touched. King Tut was buried in a series of 3 coffins, one inside the other. The first 2 coffins were made of wood covered in bands of gold, but the innermost coffin was made of solid gold and covered with gems. Tut's beautiful burial mask was also made of pure gold. Heavy jeweled bracelets encircled his wrists, and golden amulets and necklaces were draped around his neck. Do you know? The Egyptians stopped making mummies around AD 400. By this time, most Egyptians had converted to Christianity. They no longer believed that the dead person needed to be mummified in order to experience eternal life. Animal mummies. The ancient Egyptians mummified animals as well as people. Cats were especially sacred to the Egyptians. They represented Bast, the cat-headed goddess of happiness. Cats were kept as pets, and when one died, the whole family shaved their heads and eyebrows in mourning. Cat mummies were buried with their owners or at the temples of Bast. Ancient Egyptians also mummified other animals sacred to the gods, such as crocodiles, ibises, and falcons. These animals were sent to the afterlife as offerings to the gods. Conclusion. Natural mummies have been found around the world. They can be found in the cold, acidic water of a marsh in Denmark, in the frozen depths of an alpine glacier, or in the hot sands of a desert. The dead have been preserved as mummies by many different cultures, from Buddhist monks in Japan to tribesmen in Papua New Guinea. The Incas in Peru, half a world away from the ancient Egyptians, mummified their ancestors in much the same way as the Egyptians. While artificial and natural mummification vary in some ways, they are alike in one important way. All mummification results in the arrest of cell decay, which preserves the body for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We can learn much about ancient civilizations by studying mummies and the contents of their tombs. Scientists around the world study mummies in order to know more about how ancient people lived and died. Where mummies have been found: Africa, Egypt, Nubia. South Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea. Asia, Japan, Honshu, China, Siberia, Indonesia. North America, Northern Canada, Southwestern U.S., Mexico. South America, Peru. Europe, Alps, Italy, Austria, Denmark, Southern Italy, Greenland. Try this. Make your own mummies. 1. Cut an apple into 12 wedges. 2. Put half the wedges skin side down on a baking sheet. 3. Bake in an oven on low heat for an hour or until dry. Low heat is about 100 degrees Celsius, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. You could also put the apple wedges in a warm, dry place in the sun for several days. 4. Remove the apple wedges after they have dried out. 5. Place them next to the 6 apple wedges that have not been dried. 6. Notice the differences between the two groups of wedges after several days inside at room temperature.